Hey Optimancers, Chris here. I've been ranking all the subclasses in D&D, and this is where we are so far. Now, if you would like to see this image bigger, there's a link for it in the video description. Last week we discussed the Paladin, and they all fit into the higher than average tiers because, the base Paladin is so good, and then you add a subclass, and that subclass, its level 3 feature is based off an extremely limited resource, and they're not getting anything else until level 7. So the base class there is doing most of the heavy lifting, which is why they were kind of all packed together. Today is a little bit different, because we are looking at Rangers, and when the Player's Handbook first came out, it didn't take long for players to pinpoint the Ranger as a poor option. The Beastmaster subclass was a mess. Favored Enemy didn't seem to do much of anything at all. Natural Explorer was weird, strangely designed. Primeval Awareness was awful. Landstride, super circumstantial. Hide in Plain Sight was atrocious. Feral Sight was bad. Even their capstone was disappointing. And now they got spells, but even their spellcasting mechanics seemed weaker than the Paladin, which was the obvious comparison since they had the same spell progression. But while the Paladin could switch out spells, the Ranger couldn't, and they didn't have many known spells. Now, I do think that the Ranger got a bit of a bad rap in public opinion, because, you know what, you still got access to the archery fighting style, extra attack. There are a number of really good spells on their list. Even though they can't choose too many of them, there's still good choices to make. But there was no question the Ranger wasn't one of the better classes at that point. Then some things happened. Xanathars threw some great subclasses at us. Then Tasha's, some more good subclasses, and they let you switch out those terrible abilities for abilities I would say are pretty much without exception better designed. Now, it's really strange, because I tend to see this kind of black and white thing with the opinions on Ranger, especially since after Tasha's. There's some players who are still complaining it sucks. This is really weird to me, because so much has been improved. I mean, what did you need to have this not suck? And then others that I've heard more recently that seem to have taken this polar opposite view, and they think Rangers are amazing, which, frankly, I also find weird. Rangers overall are decent. Some of the subclasses are good, some aren't, and I'm going to sort them out today. If you want to support this content, consider clicking the link in the video description to come visit my Patreon. Patrons of this channel can receive rewards like getting to see these videos early and non-monetized, and top-level patrons can join me and play some D&D each month. Today I want to recognize some of my top-level patrons: Nick Simmons, Pedro Davaca, Philip Martin, Philip Glorvigen, Robbies, Rohit, Ryan Squire, Safes, Sajin Abraham, and Scott Ballantyne. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. First, let's go over the ranking system. If you've seen this part, feel free to jump to the next timestamp on the video. So here is how it will work. I will not be discussing any subclass that is not official content. So subclasses that are third-party or playtest material are not included. This is a power ranking, so I'm not taking into account how well they are designed in this ranking or my personal preference. This will take into account how powerful they are as a single class build, as well as how powerful they are when multi-classed. I will be assuming feats are allowed and used, and that all the optional class features in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything are allowed as well. Just some things to note as well. Features are weighted by how soon they are received. A feature you get at level 3 is much more valuable than a feature you get at level 10, because these features see way more gameplay when you actually play the subclass. So this is not a comparison of which of these subclasses are more powerful at 20th level. I don't think that's very relevant to players. This is a comparison as to which you will find most powerful, assuming you are starting at low level and advancing levels through gameplay. A feature you have for 100% of that time is 5 times more valuable than a feature you're going to have for 20%. And although I will consider all 3 pillars of gameplay, I will be weighing the combat tier most heavily. The combat tier tends to be the tier that is most reliant on mechanics, and mechanics is what I'm looking at here. I also assume you will not be playing as a solo character. So features that work well with teammates, or even better, improve your teammates, will be considered in the ranking. Now before we begin, I'm going to address a couple common misconceptions before they come up. A bad feature does not make a subclass less powerful. I can add 10 terrible and practically useless features to the most powerful subclasses, and they're still the most powerful. I'm only looking at features that make a subclass better. Secondly, just because a feature can be replicated with a feat does not mean the feature isn't good. Feats are not free, and they can be very powerful. They can even be more powerful than a subclass feature. So, a feature that can be replicated by a good feat can still be a great feature, improving the power level of the subclass. And the person playing that subclass has one extra feat they can use on any of the many potent feats in the game. I guarantee you're not going to have enough feats, and having one more is a big benefit. These rankings, of course, are subjective, and I don't expect anyone to agree with them in their entirety. And I do have some personal biases, which will probably become apparent. I like spells. I think they can be very powerful. And that's going to be clear enough as we move forward. Also, I should say, I like to make my saving throws, and I don't care who knows it. Give me a way to do that more reliably, and I'm likely to consider a subclass more powerful because of it. Finally, I don't assume you will be limited to one encounter per day. I don't assume you will have short rests whenever you want. So features that can be used more often, I consider to be more powerful than single-use ones. Now, this is a very common rating system in D&D for the ranking of classes and subclasses, and it includes anywhere from the S tier being the highest and the D tier being the lowest, and I will not be using it. Instead, I'll be using this expanded tier chart that includes an E and F tier. Here are the criteria I will be ranking the subclasses with. If I give a subclass an S tier ranking, I don't just think it's powerful. I think it's probably too powerful. I think there are some potentially game-breaking mechanics involved, and these are going to come into play without requiring high-level play at all. My issue with these subclasses is you have a real possibility of invalidating other player character features. This can lead to overshadowing other players, and so if you're a power gamer, these options are for you. If you aren't, I would think carefully before selecting an S tier subclass. If I give a subclass an A tier ranking, I think it's a very powerful option. Characters using an A tier subclass are easy to optimize and have features that should be showstoppers in gameplay, stomping down challenges with abandon. We may not break the game, but we're definitely going to make it a fair bit easier. If I give a subclass a B tier ranking, I think it's a good subclass. Optimizing a B tier subclass should result in a very effective character that has a strong contribution to a party of characters. Even with limited optimization, a B tier subclass is probably still going to be reasonably effective. If I give a subclass a C tier ranking, I think it's a decent option. Optimizing a C tier subclass may require a bit more thought about how to make the best use of the features, but they can still be quite effective if handled with some thought and consideration. If I give a subclass a D tier ranking, I think it's serviceable. Optimizing a D tier rank subclass will lead to a decent character that can usually still pull their weight, but I wouldn't expect to stand out. If I give a subclass an E tier ranking, I think it's a weaker option. An E tier subclass needs some extra effort to make a character that contributes effectively at all, or perhaps the contributions they make end up being extremely narrow, or rely heavily on other characters helping them out. It's still possible to make a character that can be somewhat effective with an E tier subclass, but if you just play it as it's presented, you can probably expect a disappointing experience. If I give a subclass an F tier ranking, I think it's basically unredeemable. An F tier ranked subclass differentiates from an E tier subclass because it is bound to disappoint, and there just aren't any good ways to optimize it to make it worthwhile. And the F tier subclasses, along with the S tier subclasses, I think can be a problem when considering a team of players because they create pretty overwhelming imbalance. Subclasses aren't balanced against each other, and that's normally okay. But when you have these extreme cases on either end, it can weaken the game. When subclasses receive the same rank, I will be placing subclasses I think are more potent, more to the left of the chart, with the weaker further to the right. So at the end of this series, I will have a comprehensive list from top to bottom of every class and subclass combination in the game, all 114 of them. So first thing, before we get into the class abilities, is that we're often going to be choosing whether we get an original feature or we switch it out for an optional feature from Tasha's. So I will be going over those in pairs. We start our ranger off with D10 hit points, which is good. Light and medium armor with shield proficiency, which means if we're going to go melee, that can stretch our ability scores a bit. So it's a bit of an encouragement there to go ranged. Strength and dexterity are the proficient saving throws, and we get 3 skill proficiencies, which is 1 additional proficiency over the standard. We get 2 additional features at first level, and we have 2 different options for each of them. So first, favored enemy. You choose a creature type and you get advantage on survival rolls to track or intelligence rolls to recall information about them, and you get an additional language that is spoken by the enemy. If you choose humanoid as your favored enemy, you select 2 specific types of humanoid that this applies to, which makes sense. There are a lot more humanoids than any other creature type. The problem, though, is it's just not potent. Even when you come across your favorite enemy, it's not that great. A bonus to tracking rolls is really specific, and intelligence checks, with a class that needs dexterity, constitution, and wisdom, and maybe strength too, we just can't do anything but dump our intelligence. So we get advantage on something that we're bad at, we're still not going to be good at those checks. And that's all this really gives us. Really, it's a language and a tracking bonus against a very limited number of creatures. And this feature technically scales, but it's still just more languages, and the tracking bonus applies to more creatures. Even at 14th level of scaling, we're talking about advantage on 1 skill check against a limited number of enemies. And then the intelligence stuff, which, again, we're just not good at. This feature, honestly, was ignorable. Now, we can swap it for favored foe after Tasha's. When you hit a creature with an attack roll, you can add a d4 to the damage if your concentration is available. Then you can add the damage again against that specific creature once to an attack that hits on each of your turns. This scales to a d6 at level 6 and a d8 at level 14. You can do this a number of times per long rest equal to your proficiency bonus. So basically twice per day, but it scales with your level. Now, I don't think this is a very good ability either. The damage bonus is quite small, and it uses concentration, and is just against a single creature each time we use it. But you know what? If it's that, or sometimes I get advantage on a tracking roll, I'll take favored foe. But let's not kid ourselves that it makes a big difference. If you want to be a linguist and get some extra languages, go ahead, keep favored enemy. You're not giving up very much. The other feature we get at level 1 is Natural Explorer. You choose a type of terrain, and in that terrain you double your proficiency bonus to an intelligence or wisdom check related to that terrain. So that's not all intelligence or wisdom checks, but it isn't super clear what related to your terrain means. Like, let's say I make a perception check to notice a hidden enemy. Do I get the bonus? They are hiding in the terrain I'm specialized in, so I guess maybe. I mean, it'd be nice if that was spelled out more clearly. Also, what about my passive perception? Does that get doubled the proficiency? I guess sometimes it would, other times not. So, we kind of have to figure that out every time it comes up. Then we get a bunch of bonuses to traveling for the whole party in the terrain once we've been traveling for at least an hour. This includes doing things like we can ignore the penalties for difficult terrain, you can't become lost, forging bonuses, increased alertness, etc. These kinds of bonuses can have a mechanical advantage. I mean, not being able to become lost is a pretty big mechanical advantage. Though I think from a gameplay perspective, I think it's horrible. Basically, we remove challenges rather than getting a bonus to overcome them. So it could be occasionally useful, but it's sure not fun. Run out of the abyss with a ranger with favored terrain for the Underdark, and that's going to be a dull campaign. I mean, that alone could ruin it. Still, this is a mechanic's power evaluation, and not becoming lost, not being affected with difficult terrain and travel, increased alertness, all these things are significant mechanical benefits to the exploration portion of the game. One significant drawback of this feature, though, is it is massively campaign dependent. Even as you add additional terrains with level increases, there's no city terrain here, there's no dungeon terrain, there's no sailing on the ocean terrain, so there are campaigns where you're just never going to get to use this. Our other option is Deft Explorer. This is going to be way more consistently relevant. We pick a skill proficiency and we double our proficiency bonus for that skill. So basically like expertise. I will take that over a wisdom or intelligence-based skill check specifically related to a specific kind of terrain any day. We also get 2 additional languages. Now, I should say, I don't think languages add much in the way of power. They're really not affecting these rankings at all, how many languages you get. But I will say if you want a ton of extra languages, well, keep favored enemy and take this. We're talking 3 additional languages right from first level. The scaling on this is quite nice though, because we're not just adding more double proficiency skills. Instead, we get improved mobility, then we get some temporary hit points, and improved exhaustion recovery. Overall, I think this is way better than Natural Explorer, both for fun and mechanically. Improved speed is also useful in combat. At second level, we get a fighting style, and including the optional class features, that's archery, defense, dueling, 2-weapon fighting, blind fighting, thrown weapon fighting, and druidic warrior, which is unique to rangers and provides 2 druid cantrips. So archery is a really good fighting style, and once again we see rangers nudged towards archery. You can go melee with a ranger, but it just doesn't seem to be the most powerful option in this case. That said, I do think there are some other decent options here. With Druidic Warrior, I do think we have better options with this than with the Paladin's Blessed Warrior. Cantrips like Shillelagh and Thornwhip definitely provide a few interesting ways to build a ranger that could be somewhat effective, but I still think we're not matching just picking archery. Archery clearly to me is the most powerful option here. At level 2 we get spells. This follows the same half-casting mechanic as the Paladin. We get no cantrips, and we skill spellcasting as if gaining a full caster level every other level. This is not comparable in gameplay to playing a full caster. Half-casting ends up being less than half as strong because of how spellcasting scaling works. A 10th level caster is more than twice as powerful as a 5th level caster. Still, spellcasting, even half-casting, really does add a lot to the ranger. Each spell is like adding an option to a class feature, and each spell level is like a new feature, with the slots being uses per day. There is a lot we can do with that. As for the ranger spell list, I think it's a pretty good list for a half-caster. There are some big standout options, and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything also added some really good spell options to the rangers. The ranger uses the spell's known mechanic, which means they select a small number of spells they can cast, and they can't change that except at level ups. Spellcasting also uses wisdom, which can stretch a ranger's ability scores pretty thin. Though technically there are spells you can take that aren't reliant on wisdom, and your wisdom is also not factored into the number of spells known. So a low wisdom ranger is possible to make viable, though especially after Tasha's, we do give up on some really good options. So I think the ranger is better off making the sacrifice to ensure we have a pretty good wisdom score on an optimized build. Though when it comes to casting, a ranger isn't feeding other class features through spell slots like a paladin does with smiting, so ultimately that means a ranger has more of those spell slots left for actually casting spells. A lot of their spells are concentration, and a ranger isn't proficient in constitution saving throws. So this can create a hard decision when you are also needing your feats to support weapon use. At 3rd level, the ranger picks their subclass. This is the most common point for subclass selection, and they get at least one feature right away, then more at 7th, 11th, and 15th level. For the reasons I go over when discussing the rating system, for the purposes of ranking, I'll be weighting the 3rd level features heavily, the 11th level features lightly. The 15th level features I'm not going to be weighing at all. At level 3 they also get Primeval Awareness, which is just awful. But this does touch on a misconception I mentioned in the rating system portion of this video, because getting an additional base class feature at the level you get your subclass is not normally how it works. Usually the subclass is the feature. So no matter how bad Primeval Awareness is, I mean, it's not worse than getting nothing. And I often see that. Players will point to features like Primeval Awareness as evidence that rangers are weak, but they don't complain that a fighter is only getting a subclass at level 3. So this is just an error in reasoning. Getting an extra feature, even a bad one, doesn't make a class any weaker. Though with Tasha's, we actually get a replacement for that that's pretty good. Primal Awareness, which is a way better option than Primeval Awareness. That's not hard. Basically, we get a circumstantial spell at level 3, as well as every level where we get a higher level spell slot that we can cast once per long rest without using a spell slot. Now, every single spell on this list is circumstantial, so I wouldn't count on getting the opportunity to cast them, or cast them usefully anyway. But when the circumstances do come up where they're useful, we can cast these spells, and we don't need to select them through our limited spells known, or expend a spell slot. So, like I said, that's not a bad feature at all. And this is in addition to our 3rd level subclass features. Ability score improvements are standard for the Ranger, so 4th, 8th, 12th, 16th, and 19th level, just like most classes receive. At level 5 we get extra attack. Obviously this is a common level 5 feature, but that doesn't mean we should discount how potent it can be. I often see level 5 as a jump point for multiclassing Rangers, and that is because of extra attack. At 8th level, we're adding Land Stride. This allows movement through difficult terrain or non-magical plants without extra movement, and advantage on saving throws against spells that use plants to hinder movement. This can be okay, but obviously it's circumstantial. And this one doesn't have a different option, which is fine. Like I said, it's okay. Then at level 10 we get Hide in Plain Sight, which is just stinky. So once again, we want to switch that out for the Tasha's option, which is Nature's Veil. This gives you a short duration invisibility that doesn't require concentration or reveal you if you make an attack. It's usable a number of times per long rest, equal to your proficiency bonus, and this is pretty good. I mean, we're talking about advantage to hit and disadvantage to be hit a few rounds a day. Now, a bonus action isn't free, so this might conflict with some other things we can do, but you know, you can keep that in mind as you make your build. Nothing else received before level 14, so that's our chassis. First off, with multiclassing, the Ranger does okay. It's not a very good 1-level dip, but you know, as a 5-level investment mixed with something else, it can be reasonably good. Mixes strongly with Cleric or Druid, not too bad with Fighter or Rogue as well. Wouldn't say it's one of the better multiclass options, but it can work. If you do get to 11th level, you might want to jump out of Ranger at that point as well. Now we get all the basic stuff for setting up good ranged weapon use up to level 5, right on the base Ranger. But after level 5 there is not a lot of weapon support afterwards, which does hurt a bit. Options like the Guardian of Nature spell can eventually provide additional weapon support, or we could just use summoning to kind of work alongside our weaponry. But we are looking at high levels. Remember, we are gaining these kinds of spells much later because we are progressing so much more slowly. If we were to multiclass out of Ranger at level 5 and then pop right into Druid, we'd get Conjure Animals 1 level later than if we just went straight Ranger, and it will not take long for us to surpass. Again, that half casting is pretty crippling. Now, for utility, a Ranger is pretty stacked actually. The extra skill proficiency, then proficiency doubling, primal awareness, and some good utility spell options really give the Ranger quite a few options. I want to contrast something here with monks too. Notice that Favored Foe has its own use pool, and then primal awareness has its own use pool, and Nature's Veil, and the temporary hit points through Deft Explorer. And spells for that matter. We can use these things without having to give up using other things, like a monk who is always pulling off the same resource pool. As for the power of the chassis in the first place, I think it's not bad. I don't think it's great, but it's not terrible. Even the Player's Handbook Beastmaster wouldn't have been an F, in my opinion, and every option we have now is better than that. Subclasses do heavier lifting for the Ranger than they do for a class like the Paladin, so we are going to see a bigger spread here, because some classes really do that heavy lifting, and others really don't. So let's get into the subclasses. First up is the Beastmaster. This subclass is unique in that the designers basically did a subclass overhaul in Tasha's. It's the overhauled version I'm going to be ranking because I think it's basically the standard for Beastmasters now. Player's Handbook version would have ranked an E though. It's honestly a mess, and although you could technically make a Beastmaster Ranger ultimately viable, I did a video showing how that could be done, but it wasn't easy and you didn't leave a lot of options. And even then, it was passable. So that's an E by definition. Worst in the game? I don't think so. But it wasn't good. Let's see how things have changed. First, we get Primal Companion. This provides you a beast pet of either land, sky, or sea variety. Several of the beast statistics, including armor class, hit points, and attack damage, scale with your ranger level. The beast acts on your turn in combat and dodges with its action unless you use your bonus action to command it to do something else. You also have the option to give up an attack to command it to take the attack action only, which usually isn't going to be the option you want to select unless you have some kind of really important bonus action, like maybe you have to cast a Zephyr Strike this turn to get out of trouble or something like that. But most of the time, the bonus action to make the command I think is the way to go. There's something here I think I should highlight, and that is the beast is going on your turn. Normally a pet takes its turn immediately after yours, and that might not sound like much of a difference, but being able to coordinate your actions and mix them with another creature's actions is really a tactical benefit that is pretty unique. If the beast dies, you can revive it to full hit points with a single spell slot and 1 minute at a time. You can also change the type of beast you have after a long rest. So actually now I would say this is a pretty good feature. Pet features generally are pretty good, I think, just from the action economy alone, but also adding another target to the encounter spreads enemy damage, or it could just be some bonus action damage without requiring a feat. Then at level 7 we get Exceptional Training, and I should mention that Primal Companion replaces the original Beastmaster level 3 feature, but we still get the original subclass features at higher levels. So once again we're looking at the original Beastmaster, and Exceptional Training to some degree became redundant with Tasha's because we can already give commands with a bonus action, so being able to give some commands with the bonus action doesn't give us anything. We could already do that. But now the beast attacks are treated as magical, which by this point we're starting to really need. So if we want the beast to take the attack action, we do need the attacks to be magical. At level 11 we get Bestial Fury, which basically gives our beast multi-attack, doubling its offensive capability, which should be a pretty decent boost. And that's the Beastmaster. We get a good level 3 ability. Level 7 is not dramatic, largely redundant, and level 11 is pretty good again. Our bonus actions are basically going to be used up all the time though, just because we need to command our beast. So this does limit our weapon enhancing feat options. In the end, I think the Beastmaster does just fine. I don't think it's become one of the best Ranger subclasses, and it remains one of the only subclasses for Ranger that doesn't get any additional known spells, which is unfortunate. But you know what, it can be built to do okay damage, improve the action economy, present an additional target on the battlefield that is easily revived if it goes down in combat, and overall I think it ranks C. It's middle of the road as a Ranger subclass, and I'd say middle of the road overall. Next up is the Fey Wanderer. This was introduced in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. I think this is one of the best subclass designs I've seen in this game, with every feature being useful and features increasing in potency as we gain levels. The subclass offers extra known spells. I don't think Charm Person adds a lot, but you know what? Misty Step? Sign me up. And Dispel Magic is a good spell. And the Ranger spell list, by the way, is one of the only ones in the game that doesn't already have access to Dispel Magic. Dimension Door is amazing, of course, but that's 13th level, so don't make any plans to cast that in most campaigns at all. At 3rd level, we're going to get Dreadful Strikes. This allows us to deal an additional D4 psychic damage when we hit a creature with a weapon attack. There's no range on this, and it doesn't use your bonus action. I bring that up because some similar Ranger abilities for other subclasses have those requirements. Another thing I should mention is this is limited to once per turn to that target. So if we were to split our targets, we could apply it more than once per turn, though I would say tactically, usually you're better off just concentrating on single enemies. Damage does scale to a d6, but not until we reach 11th level. We get Otherworldly Glamour that adds our Wisdom modifier to any charisma check, and we get a bonus skill proficiency. Bonus skill proficiency is always okay. Now, the bonus here, I would say, in most cases, is just allowing us to base more skills off Wisdom, which is fine, I guess. There may be a party where that's helpful, though a lot of classes use Charisma as a primary ability score already, so if you're just looking for somebody to cover those skills, good chance somebody already is covering those skills. I mean, hypothetically, we could stack a Charisma bonus with a Wisdom bonus here, and then be even better, but practically, I think the best we can hope for is that adding our Charisma modifier isn't penalizing us. When you build a Ranger, you just can't afford to do much with your Charisma. So, this is decent. Keep in mind that social roles can be group checks, and now you aren't dragging down everybody else. Or, you know what, sometimes the DM is going to specifically call for you to make a check, in which case, you're not going to be terrible like most Rangers are. And there's the extra proficiency, so that's nice too. So now we have a decent number of skill proficiencies. So, I think we do fine at 3rd level. Bit more damage, bit more utility. There's nothing dramatic here though. But you know what, it's okay. At level 7 we get Beguiling Twist. This gives us advantage on Charm or Frightened saving throws. And each of those do come up in play, so that's decent. In addition, we get a pretty interesting reaction where if a creature we can see within 120 feet, which is more than enough, and that creature can be an ally or an enemy, if they make their save against being charmed or frightened, then we can use our reaction to force a different creature we can see with the same good range to make a Wisdom saving throw or be charmed or frightened by us. And it's our choice whether charmed or frightened. I mean, honestly, frightened is going to be probably the lion's share, and then it lasts up to a minute. They get an additional save on each of their turns to end the effect before the duration expires. Technically speaking, there is no limit here. You use up your reaction and you need the trigger in the first place, but within that, this can be done without resources. Also, unlike spells that do similar things, this does not use concentration. So, how good is this? Well, it might be okay, and it might be great. Really depends how often a creature within 120 feet that we can see successfully saves against being charmed or frightened. If we do absolutely nothing to create that situation, it'll come up here and there. If we do create that situation, it may come up all the time. This is very much an optimizable feature if we either make our build around it, or we coordinate with other party members so that they work around it. But at worst, this is a solid feature, because it's not just the reaction, but the save advantage too, against both charmed and frightened. And remember that, okay? Just because, again, it's going to come up later. Advantage on charm, advantage on frightened, you might have even forgotten about those once we started talking about the reaction, but they're there too. Wouldn't it really suck if a subclass only got one of those things? Then at level 11, we get Fey Reinforcements. This gives us an additional spell known of 3rd level, and it's a good spell. So, right off, that's nice. It's also a spell that normally requires an expensive material component, and we would normally need a free hand to access that component, but we don't need that, so also nice. Then we can cast it once per long rest without expending a spell slot, so it's basically an extra 3rd level spell slot, so nice. Finally, if we reduce the duration of the spell from 1 hour to 1 minute, we can cast it without concentration. And that's really quite nice. Summoning that doesn't require concentration is basically unheard of, though I will say, A one action casting with a 1 minute duration is going to mean that we lose that action, probably in combat, to set it up. Also, we're using a 3rd level spell slot when we first get this. So a full spellcaster like a druid that uses their highest level slot is getting a very different creature than we would be getting, even if they're just upcasting this spell, which honestly is probably not what they're doing when they have 6th level slots. And I'm just pointing that out because I want to highlight the difference between what a full caster can do and what a half caster can do is really palpable. And so if you're a weapon user, then using your action in combat and not hitting things with your weapon so that you can cast a spell less potent than what other casters are doing, it's just a lot less dramatic. It still can be good though, but it's not going to be as good. But what we have with the Fey Wanderer is decent 3rd level stuff. Decent, potentially quite good 7th level stuff, pretty good 11th level stuff, and some nice extra spells. So overall, I think the Fey Wanderer is above average power-wise in regards to rangers. It's not the top, and just remember, a C tier ranking means it can be quite strong with some good optimization, but otherwise it should be fine. And that's what we have here. We have some real options for optimization, but you know what? The base features on their own are okay. Next up is the Gloom Stalker. I have to say there were about 3 years after this was released in Xanathar's Guide to Everything where every single ranger I saw was a Gloom Stalker. I still see them a lot. We get additional spells known, again, for each level of spell we cast. The list here isn't bad. I think you'll occasionally cast any of these spells, and none of them are normally available to rangers. It's largely utility until 9th level. Then we get Fear. Fear is a good spell in combat, and it's still useful at 9th level. I discussed actually some of the issues with combining action spells with a weapon user earlier in this video, and specifically the Fear spell in my last video. And the same things still apply. I will cast this with my 9th level Gloom Stalker, yes, absolutely. But action casting spells with short duration are not overly synergetic with what is primarily a weapon user. Also, for a Gloom Stalker to cast this, normally something like this you would want to cast on the first round of combat, and actually a Gloom Stalker is actually giving up more if they do that. And that's largely because of our first 3rd level feature, which is Dread Ambusher. How much do you want for one ability? We're going to get a bonus to initiative rolls equal to our wisdom modifier at the first round of combat, an additional attack, and an increase to walking speed. And if we hit with that attack, we do an additional d8 damage as well. Also, I should note the wording is, if you take the attack action on that turn, you can make one additional weapon attack as part of that action. So by that wording, if you were to multiclass with 2 levels of fighter, and then use Action Surge to get an additional attack action on that turn, the extra attack, as well as the boosted damage, would apply to that action as well. The other feature we get at 3rd level is Umbral Sight, which is also really good. You get Dark Vision, or Improved Dark Vision if you have it already, and you are invisible to any creature relying on Dark Vision to see you when you are in darkness. So basically, that's improved invisibility with no concentration whenever that happens. That is a massive offensive and defensive boost. Now, darkness in combat isn't something you can count on. A lot of places just aren't dark to begin with. But on the other hand, there could be entire sessions where you can use this in every single combat. And when that happens, the Gloom Stalker is, well, practically unrivaled. So either of these 3rd level features would be good enough to make for a solid level 3. But getting both really is unmatched by any ranger. At level 7, we gain proficiency in wisdom saving throws. This is great. This would give us, with one feat selection, the ability to get the 3 big save proficiencies, and that would cover 90% of the saving throws you're ever going to make. Really nice feature. Then at level 11, we get Stalker's Flurry, so whenever we make weapon attacks on our turn, and we miss at least once, we get another attack. So that's not quite as good as just getting an extra attack, like a fighter does at the same level, but still, I would expect, more often than not, you're going to get an extra attack out of this. So it's solid. So the Gloom Stalker gives and gives and gives right at 3rd level. You're getting twice or more at level 3 what we would normally see from a ranger subclass. But the Gloom Stalker is you know what? Still giving pretty good features later on as well. I don't think it's a surprise that I say the Gloom Stalker is easily the most powerful ranger in D&D. And it is dead easy to optimize too. There are some neat multiclassing options like I referred to earlier, but you know what? Just a straight Gloom Stalker with the standard stuff is going to do really well. I kind of debated between high B and low A for quite a while on this one. It is definitely in that range. In the end, I've decided on a low A. You are always going to perform well. But when Umbral Sight comes into play, Gloom Stalker is going to stand out almost like nothing else. Next up is the Horizon Walker. This was also in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. We get extra spells known, and this is a pretty solid list. Again, I really like Misty Step on a half-casting weapon user. It can be really significant. Haste is okay as well. Protection from evil and good is okay some of the time. Pretty circumstantial. And at level 3 we get Detect Portal. You can magically sense the presence of a planar portal. And then there's some stuff on how that works. And I think you can probably skip that part because, I mean, I guess I'm sure there's someone out there that's been in a campaign where this might have been helpful. But not me. I literally cannot think of one instance in any campaign I've ever played in where this would have been helpful. Even once. So I'm going to ignore this one. Like I said, a bad feature isn't worse than no feature. So let's just pretend we only got one feature at level 3 instead of 2. So we get Planar Warrior at level 3. I basically consider this the only Horizon Walker feature at level 3. As a bonus action, you can choose a creature within 30 feet, and the next time you hit a creature with a weapon attack on that turn, the damage becomes force damage, and you add a d8 to the damage. It scales at 11th level and becomes 2d8. So overall, this is passable, I guess, but I don't think it's very good. A bonus action every single time. So basically, we're eating up all of our bonus action. Consider what a bonus action does for a Beastmaster. Then look at this, a d8 damage. The force damage thing, I generally think is almost worthless. At lower levels, if you haven't gotten a magic weapon, it could help you deal with damage resistance. But once you have a magic weapon, it's almost never facing resistance anyways. Finally, the 30-foot range here is not very good. Honestly, this could end up being an issue using this at all some of the time. It certainly might prevent you from picking the opponent you wanted to. So, I don't think a Horizon Walker does very well at all at 3rd level. 7th level, they pick up Ethereal Step, allowing you to cast Etherealness as a bonus action, but it only lasts 1 turn. Still, that's enough to walk through walls or that kind of thing. The use here is pretty limited though. It's just once per short or long rest. But I could see this handy for utility or exploration. I could also occasionally see this being used in combat to do things like move through cover. But overall, this one is definitely better than what we got at level 3, but it's not great. Then at 11th level we get Distant Strike, which allows us to teleport 10 feet before every attack while we're using the attack action on our turn. If we split up our attacks, we can get a 3rd attack against a 3rd creature. So finally we get a feature that's good. Teleporting is super useful, and this isn't even eating up our bonus action or anything. And we can squeeze out a 3rd attack in combat, though it does limit our target selection if we do that. So Horizon Walker has a great 11th level feature. There are nice extra spells known. 3rd level is pretty rough. We're just not getting much right off the bat here. And you know what? Even at 7th level, we're just getting a feature usable once per rest for some decent utility or mobility. Frankly, I'd say if your goal is to have a ranger with good mobility, look at the Fey Wanderer. I think it's going to fit the bill, and I think it's a better subclass. 7th level, like I said, super limited. So again, this really doesn't come online until 11th level. And I'm thinking that is going to be, that's going to be actually after some campaigns are over. But even the ones where it's not, it's probably very close to the end of the campaign. That's pretty late to get your first subclass feature that really makes a difference. So I think this ends up in either low C or high D territory. I think the spell list, the extra spells known, bump it up just to barely a low C. but I'd say this is definitely worse than the Beastmaster. That brings us to the Hunter. This was the other Ranger subclass in the Player's Handbook. For a long time, it was the not terrible Ranger selection. Though, frankly, as I look at it again, I don't think it's aged particularly well when we start seeing the new options that are available for Rangers. So first off, like the Beastmaster, we get no extra spells known. This hurts. We just don't get a lot of spells without some kind of boost, and almost every subclass gets them. We don't. At 3rd level, we get one feature. It is Hunter's Prey. We do get to select, though, from 3 different options. Colossus Slayer provides an extra d8 damage once per turn when we hit a creature with a weapon attack if it's already wounded. We usually have a viable target for this, but even if we don't, if we're attacking more than once, we have a decent chance of setting up a viable target and still inflicting this damage. Generally, with Colossus Slayer, that d8 gets added most of the time. Not 100% of the time, but definitely most of the time. Also, it's not just on your turn, so if you make a reaction attack on someone else's turn, you should be able to apply this in addition. Our second option is Giant Killer. You get a reaction attack when a larger creature within 5 feet of you attacks you, and that's whether they hit or miss. So this one, I just wouldn't count on getting to use it very often. If you're a ranged character, which most Rangers end up being, you may not use this much at all, but even if you are in melee, you need to be fighting the big creature, and they need to be attacking you, not with reach, which a lot of bigger creatures have, and this uses up your reaction. And frankly, if you're in melee, often the feats we pick up are giving us reaction options, so we could even have conflict there. I'm just not a fan of Giant Killer. Then we get Horde Breaker. This can provide us an additional attack on our turn, but there's a restriction for targets, and even more of a problem, there needs to be another viable target within 5 feet of the initial target, which, again, is just not something we can expect. So this is an extra attack against a target you didn't choose freely once in a while. So, 3 options here, but I bet you can guess which one I see get taken most often. Colossus Slayer by a mile. I have seen Horde Breaker taken occasionally as well, but I find that it's almost universal disappointment because the player expected it to come up more often than it ended up coming up. So how good is Colossus Slayer? It's okay. I'd expect, 4 or 5 extra damage on a round if you hit at least once most of the time. But in the case of a lot of these subclasses, we can't compare this to a single Ranger subclass feature. We're comparing it to multiple features because it's pretty standard now for Ranger subclasses to get 2 features at level 3 plus the additional spells known. There are some exceptions. Hunter gets 1 feature, no extra spells, and the only subclass Ranger comparable to that is the Beastmaster. And the Beast Companion I think is a fair bit better than Colossus Slayer. Though, you know what? Colossus Slayer at least isn't using up your bonus action. 7th level we get Defensive Tactics, and again we get 3 options. The first is Escape the Horde, which applies disadvantage to opportunity attacks made against you. That's hopefully not a lot of attacks. Generally, I would not expect this to come up very often in the average battle. And I should point out that as a Ranger, we have ways of getting out of that situation without providing an opportunity attack at all. So maybe we should consider those rather than a 7th level feature, and the only feature we get at 7th level, to give disadvantage on those attacks. Second is multi-attack defense. If a creature hits you with an attack, you get a +4 armor class against all subsequent attacks made by that creature on its turn. Again, I think this is pretty circumstantial. It requires you to be hit by an attack and then for that creature to attack you again on its turn, which definitely does happen sometimes, but again, I just don't think I would expect it regularly. The third is Steel Will, which gives us advantage on saves versus being frightened. So, here's where I will bring up again the Fey Wanderer's level 7 feature, which gives us advantage on frightened and charmed, and that was only half the feature. So, this one is about 1/4 as good as that. And it's not that this option is that much weaker than the other 2, it's just that once we can compare it more objectively with another Ranger subclass, we just see how bad these level 7 options are for the Hunter. So, 7th level kind of sucks, actually. At 11th level, we get multi-attack, which is definitely not the same as the multi-attack that your enemies get. We essentially have two options here. First is volley. That allows us to use our action to make a single weapon attack on creatures within 10 feet of a point you can see within range. That's 4x4 on your battle map. Hypothetically, you could attack a lot of creatures. Hypothetically. In reality, maybe 3 if you're lucky. Still, I guess that's more than the 2 you would normally attack. You know, unless you have Crossbow Expert, which, by the way, isn't going to get the bonus action attack here, since this isn't taking the attack action, which is what you need to trigger Crossbow Expert. Never mind the fact you're splitting attacks. So, really not very good. The second option is Whirlwind Attack, which gives you the option to use your action to make a melee attack against any number of creatures within 5 feet of you. This has all the same problems as Volley, except now we're talking about only 8 squares, and you literally need to be surrounded. In most cases, I would say, again, you'd be lucky to get 3. And again, you aren't taking the attack action if you have Polearm Master. And with both of these, you're forced to split attacks, which is generally tactically not what you want to do. Even if your DM is nice and says, you know what, even though you didn't technically take the attack action, you can have your Crossbow Expert extra attack, or you can have your Polearm Master extra attack, I still don't think most of the time these are going to be any better than just taking the attack action. This is our 11th level feature. So I think they're both pretty bad. Now, can you make a passable hunter? Yes, you can. Colossus Slayer is okay, and its other features, although weaker than other ranger subclasses, I'd say none of them are useless. But overall, I'd say their subclass features are on the weak side, and then you gotta add on, and this is significant too, there are no extra spells known. Put that all together, and I think this is the weakest ranger subclass. Can you optimize it and make it passable? Absolutely. So it does get a D rank. So that's it. The lowest ranger subclass, in my opinion, D rank. I should mention too that with the hunter, there are some people out there who like this more than I do. But I also think that some of those same people are making a lot of assumptions regarding the 7th and 11th level features that I don't think are going to bear out in play. Next up is the Monster Slayer. This was also introduced in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. First up, we get some extra known spells. I have to say, not a fan of this list though. Pretty circumstantial stuff. Of all the subclasses' extra spells known lists, I think this is the least impressive. But you know what? If it's this or no spells, like some subclasses give us, I'll take these spells. We get 2 additional features at 3rd level. First is Slayer's Prey. As a bonus action on our turn, we can designate a creature within 60 feet, which should be enough range most of the time, and if we hit with at least 1 attack on our turn, we deal an additional d6 damage. So at first glance, this seems pretty similar to the Horizon Walker's Planar Warrior feature, except in this case it's a d6 instead of a d8. But one advantage of this is if we attack the same creature on subsequent rounds, then we don't need to use our bonus action. So that definitely does help somewhat. Also, that 60-foot range makes quite a difference. 60 feet range is not amazing, but it's still a lot better than 30 feet. Then we get Hunter's Sense, which allows us to use an action to look at a creature within 60 feet, and we learn any damage immunities, resistances, or vulnerabilities it has. This does have limited uses, but I think in most combats you're not using this anyways. I don't think you're going to run out of uses. I do think there are times where this could be invaluable. If you're scouting and you are doing this from a hidden location before a fight begins, super useful. Or if you're in the process of fighting a creature, it might be worth an action if you're having problems with resistances or immunities. So I don't think this is a bad feature, but I do think it's pretty circumstantial. So at level 3, the Monster Slayer, it's not terrible. I actually think it does better than the Horizon Walker, but it is definitely not one of the stronger subclasses at 3rd level. At 7th level, we get Supernatural Defense, which allows you to add a d6 to a saving throw or ability check to escape a grapple if caused by our Slayer's Prey. So, the escaping the grapple part, that's lame. You know who can escape a grapple without a check at all? Anyone with Misty Step. and they still get their action. But the d6 to saving throws. I do love saving throw boosts. But in this case, you do need to have your Slayer's Prey already on the right enemy to take advantage of this. Now, if you're fighting a dragon, that's pretty easy to figure out. I think that dragon might very well breathe on me, so I'm going to knock my Slayer's Prey on there. Makes sense. Even an enemy spellcaster. Makes sense. If they're within range, and you beat them on initiative. This isn't bad. A d6 is a decent boost on a saving throw. But it is circumstantial, and it requires some setup. Might even require some successful guesswork. At 11th level, you get Magic User's Nemesis, which allows you to take your reaction to attempt to foil the casting of a spell or teleportation within 30 feet, because, of course, a lot of teleportation that creatures have is in spellcasting. Target makes a saving throw, and if they fail, they lose the spell or teleport. So, right off, you have to kind of compare it with Counterspell in your head. But there are some advantages here. I mean, Counterspell can be counterspelled. This can't. And this also can work on teleportations that aren't necessarily spells. This would actually be pretty good except for one problem. It is only usable once per short rest. That is really not a lot. So again, I don't think this is useless. But this is limited in use, quite limited. And as an 11th level feature, I don't quite think it stacks up. So I think the Monster Hunter struggles. Level 3 is below average, level 7 is below average, and level 11 is below average. And the spell list, the extra spells are below average. Still, I should say, there is nothing here that is utterly useless. It's just that there's nothing here that's impressive. I think this ranks just above the Hunter. And I think it's the second weakest Ranger subclass. It's a D rank. Our final subclass is the Swarmkeeper. This was the other subclass for Ranger in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. First are extra known spells. So we actually get a cantrip, which is Mage Hand, and Mage Hand is a decent cantrip. At level 9, you're going to see we get Gaseous Form. That's okay utility, though the slot level is high. But I want to talk a bit more about the first and second level spells. Fairy Fire and Web. These are both good spells, and frankly, the first time I read this, I was super excited to see them. Who sees Web on a Ranger? Though, you know what? I have to say the more I think about it, the less excited I am. Not that I think these are bad. I think both spells are good. They really are. And casting Web with a Ranger is perfectly good. And in this case, Web actually plays very well with our third level subclass feature. And neither of these spells are normally on the Ranger spell list. And I know a lot of you are thinking, what? Fairy Fire is not a Ranger spell? No, Fairy Fire is not a Ranger spell. So why did I become less excited? Well, it just kind of occurred to me as I was thinking about it, if I want to make best use out of Web with the Swarmkeeper feature, there's another Ranger spell that already exists that I think could also work. Not identically, but of relative effectiveness, and I would probably use them both in the same kinds of situations. Because, I could cast and concentrate on Web, or I could cast and concentrate on Spike Growth. Now, there are specific situations where one might be better than the other, going either way. But generally speaking, what I notice is I'd be casting them in very similar situations with relatively equivalent effectiveness. So is there much value in having both? No, I don't think so. So I don't select Spike Growth, and I can select a different Ranger spell known, which is good, but basically it's like getting one extra known spell. It's not about Web adding a lot here that Rangers couldn't already do. I mean, Spike Growth and Web do different things, don't get me wrong, but the situation where I'd use them is very similar, and the total effectiveness, I would say, is pretty similar as well. So if this Web spell was instead Spike Growth, in other words, if this said Spike Growth instead of Web, it would have excited me a lot less, but I think it would have been of similar effectiveness. Once I took some time to think about it. Still, Web and Fairy Fire are both good spells, and I'd be glad to have them. I just don't think they separate the Swarmkeeper from other Rangers as much in spell versatility as I was originally thinking. Swarmkeeper gets Gathered Swarm at level 3. This allows you, after you successfully hit a creature with an attack, to choose from 3 options. you can add a d6 to the damage. So this alone, without any of the other options, makes this feature better than Horizon Walker or Monster Hunter level 3 features that add a die in damage, in that this doesn't have a range limit and doesn't use their bonus action. Alternatively, we can force the creature to make a strength saving throw or be moved 15 feet horizontally in the direction of our choice. Now, we can make use of this ourselves with the aforementioned web or spike growth spells quite nicely. Or, perhaps, preferably, so that we don't lose that attack action on the first turn with another spellcaster's spell effect. There's no size restriction here, which is nice, though I do find it's not super reliable because of the saving throw. But still, 15 feet in any horizontal direction, and I can set it up with a ranged attack. I'm looking at you, open hand monks. Not too shabby. Or you can move yourself 5 feet in any direction. And since this isn't relying on your base movement, presumably we can use this to escape grapples, avoid attacks of opportunity before moving, etc. So all three of these options are pretty decent. None of them are overly powerful, but all of them are decent. So one thing I'll note here is this is the only Ranger subclass since the Player's Handbook that doesn't have the standard 2 features plus extra spells at level 3. It just gets the 1 feature. It's a pretty good feature and pretty versatile, but 1 feature. At level 7 we get Writhing Tide. This provides flight with hover as a bonus action for 1 minute, a number of times per day equal to our proficiency bonus. The fly speed is 10 feet, which takes this from being an amazing feature to being an okay feature. I mean, 10 feet flight is better than no flight, but that is really slow. If you're hoping to engage flying creatures this way, it's just not going to work. You're way too slow. If you're hoping to move out of reach of landlocked creatures so you can rain down arrows from above, this might work, but you know what? You might need multiple turns of movement before you even get beyond their reach. If you need to fly up to that upper story window out of combat, this should do the trick just fine. Overall, it's not a bad feature, but that flight speed really does limit it. Then at 11th level, we get Mighty Swarm, which basically improves our 3rd level feature options. If we do the extra damage, we do a d8 instead of a d6, so 1 more point of damage on average. If we do force movement, the enemy falls prone as well if they fail their save. Knocking a creature into the Cleric Spirit Guardians is nice. Having them fall prone after pushing them into the Cleric Spirit Guardians, even better. And if we move ourselves, we get half cover until the start of our next turn, or +2 armor class. +2 armor class? Nothing to sneeze at. So overall, our 11th level feature is pretty good. And that's the Swarmkeeper. Not as many features as some subclasses at level 3, but the feature we do get is pretty good. Our extra spells, not extraordinary, but still pretty good. Level 7 is okay. It's not amazing, but not bad. And then at level 11, we get a pretty good feature. Overall, I think Swarmkeeper does better than most Rangers. I think, actually, when I look at the Fey Wanderer and the Swarmkeeper, I think they're both above average Rangers. I think they're both very workable with some good decisions or coordination with other party members. And I think both of them have a pretty big gap between them and the Gloom Stalker. So I think this is also a C rating. And to be honest, it would be very easy to put it in front or behind the Fey Wanderer. I think they're that close. I think I'm going to give Swarmkeeper a slight edge. But frankly, these two are likely going to remain side by side right to the end of this thing. And that's the Ranger. As promised, we do see a big spread here, right from A to D. But remember, D isn't terrible. You can still make a workable character with a D rank subclass, though you may not stand out compared to what other classes can do. Gloom Stalker is really a game changer though, and it really does separate itself from the rest of this list. Here is all our rankings so far. Now in our next video in this series, we're going to be moving on to the Rogue, which is interestingly another class I find really polarizing in player opinion, and again I find I'm not really in either camp. I'll explain my reasoning next time, so I hope you'll join me for that. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.